There are three big problems in risk analysis that you should keep in mind as you are analyzing your risks. The first is the analysis of critical versus chronic issues. The second is the treatment of uncertainty. And the third is screening risk. We'll talk about each of these in more detail. Critical versus chronic problems are common in the analysis of legal risk. Critical issues are often high consequence, low likelihood problems. Big litigation is an example. Chronic legal risk issues are high likelihood, low consequence problems. Contract risks are very often in this bucket. So a particular contract might not generate much risk, but the sheer number of them and the size of our contract portfolio creates risk. It is not unusual for organizations to focus on critical risks, those high consequence, low likelihood, more than the chronic issues. The second major problem is uncertainty. Uncertainty is at the heart of risk management. We do not eliminate risk uncertainty, but we can identify it and manage it and improve our risk analysis by keeping uncertainty squarely in focus. So likelihood can show up in a variety of ways. And by likelihood, we mean lack of information related to an event, likelihood, or consequence. So we can have an unknown risk event. We might not know the scope or character of the risk event. So we received word that there was an injury in the parking lot. A customer coming into our facility slipped and fell. We don't know much about the scope or character of that. Maybe it turns out later they were actually hit by a car in the parking lot and it was a delivery truck. That is a different scope and character than someone slipping on a patch of ice in January in a northern climate. We can also be uncertain about the likelihood. We might not know all the factors that contribute to the likelihood that there is an issue. So what are the factors that would contribute to a lawsuit actually being filed in the case of litigation risk, or a breach of contract emerging in a contract or a portion of our contract portfolio? We can also have unknown consequences. We cannot know what the regulatory penalties are, or there is a broad range of penalties available to a regulator, and we do not know which ones they will pick and apply in this case. So returning to our likelihood and consequences matrix here, we have likelihood on the vertical axis and consequences on the horizontal axis, and our rating 1 through 5 of those, or whatever your rating scale might be. So here are two issues, for example, where we've rated the likelihood as a 2 in the lower left and the consequences as a 2 as well. And the one on the right, we've rated a likelihood as a 3 and the consequences as a 4. Now, this assumes the same level of knowledge about both of these problems, so they are in fact spheres and well confined. But we can actually change the shape of our likelihood and consequences matrix and inject uncertainty into it and reveal that uncertainty, which is what we have here. In this case, the risk in the lower left, we are fairly certain that the consequences really are rated a 2, but notice that the likelihood might range anywhere from a 1 to a 3. This is just one way to show uncertainty about the likelihood. What we're communicating here is there's certainty about a part of the risk, but not the whole, and certainly around likelihood, we have a great deal of uncertainty. The risk on the right, we have the opposite problem. We're fairly sure that this is rated a 3 in terms of likelihood, but the consequences can range pretty widely from a 3, which we might be able to tolerate, to a 5, which we certainly could not. And as we explore our risk criteria and how to treat and work with these risks, we'll see that the shape of these and what we do about them can really matter. So addressing the uncertainty is important. So when you are dealing with uncertainty, there are 3 things you can specifically do to change the shape of those and reduce the amount of uncertainty, or at least deal with it. The first is you can identify the bounds or parameters that define the uncertainty. Let's take the case of regulatory penalties. Maybe there are a range of regulatory fines available to the government agency that's reviewed our issue and is potentially going to issue a fine. It is often the case that those regulatory penalties have a minimum and a maximum, some sort of a range. We can actually use that range to define our uncertainty. So assume the best case and assume the worst case, not in terms of likelihood. For now, we're going to assume that the violation is there and that we are actually going to get fined. The question is, how serious is the fine? We will use the upper and lower bounds of the regulatory penalty to define the scope of that. We can then layer on any multiplier effects. For example, if it's a per occurrence fine and we know we have multiple occurrences, we should use that to define the maximum penalty as well as the minimum penalty. And that defining those bounds can help narrow the scope of our uncertainty. It will not eliminate our uncertainty, but it will narrow the scope and make the risk more actionable. The second thing we can do is perform a sensitivity analysis where we identify factors that have the greatest effect on the estimate, and we work on reducing uncertainty in those areas. So in our regulatory example, we might look at the factors that cause the maximum penalty to be imposed. For example, if there is gross negligence or intentional conduct that then causes regulators to impose those maximum penalties, and we really are quite certain that it was not gross negligence or intentional, then adding that bit of knowledge to our equation might reduce the scope of our uncertainty and allow us to give a more refined rating of the consequences. And finally, as we collect data over time, we can actually apply a statistical method even to our qualitative judgments. If we have a bank of data and we have these ranges, we can actually do a Monte Carlo simulation where we iterate over thousands of possibilities based on those bounds that we have set up earlier. The third risk is screening risk. And in several places in this course, we've talked about ignoring certain risks, either because they weren't a part of our internal or external context, or we just deem them to be so unlikely or so inconsequential that they didn't even need to make the list. So those two principles are still in play, and often the consequences will cause you to ignore a particular risk. But that introduces screening risk. And in the case of screening risk, we are worried that we are going to screen out risks that should be on the list, and we are not going to do a risk analysis because they didn't even make the list. So if we have a large inventory of identified risks, means that you're going to have to screen some out. The criteria you use to screen out risks should be clear, consistently applied, and more importantly, documented. So if in a brainstorming session, for example, someone says, "Oh, I think we should worry about an asteroid landing on our manufacturing facility," and your response is, "We should ignore that because that's a very low likelihood and not even put it on the risk," you might be substantively correct, but because you're not applying a well-documented criteria for excluding that risk, you run the risk that the next risk that gets proposed that also seems unlikely gets screened out, and it should make the list. So screening creates an independent risk of false negatives, risks that are screened out but should have been screened and looked at for further analysis. So the implication of that is that screening a risk out from further analysis means that there is no risk treatment available, even if it's required or desirable. So the point here is that our own risk assessment and our own risk analysis process can in fact impose some additional risk on the organization. That's why the review and monitoring of our work is so important, and documenting our criteria for deciding what gets screened in and out is really important. So when you do that documentation, there really are four things you want to make sure to capture when you are documenting your risk analysis process to address uncertainty and screening risk as well. Make sure to measure and describe the level of uncertainty for each factor. So if you identify 4 or 5 factors that go into your judgment about the likelihood of a lawsuit or the consequences of a regulatory penalty, identify those factors and how certain or uncertain you are of each of those. Also difficult for many organizations, but it's very useful to capture disagreements among the group of experts on any of these ratings. This will allow you to go back in time and look at conclusions that were formed and whether they were correct or not, and shape how you look at those expert opinions going forward for future risk assessments. So you definitely want to capture and describe different conclusions about those factors from people on the team. Third, you want to document any assumptions you make in that risk analysis. So if you're analyzing the consequences of a cybersecurity breach, you want to document the assumption that there will not be personal information that gets obtained in that risk assessment if you made that assumption. If you made the opposite assumption that there will be personal information, you should include that. Being aware of that might lead you to put two different risks on the risk registry, one where there is personal data at risk and one where there is not. But in either case, be clear about the assumptions you made so that people can understand the scope of what you were analyzing when you rated the risk. And fourth, you want to document the quality and quantity of data that you used in the risk analysis. If you used 5 years of sales transaction data to determine the kinds of products and services that got offered, to determine whether or not a contract risk was likely or not, then you want to point to that data because that data speaks highly of the quality of the likelihood rating that you used. If, however, there was no historical data at all about the consequences of this litigation that you're facing, then the absence of that data should also be captured because it will make it clear that why you were uncertain about the consequences. It's because there was no data available for us.